Good evening, everyone. We are recording now, but we will pause as we do some pre-group things. So we look forward to having more chats with you later.
Dees is going to introduce her in just a second. But I wanted to let you know, Dr. Brown, that we don't want you to feel like you have any time constraints because we are here to learn and to be in community with you tonight, and we will adapt as needed. And so we're just glad you're here. Robin, would you please do the honors?
Yes, I'll do that quickly. I knew Dr. Brown before she knew me. Dr. Brown is a native Charlestonian, and she credits her parents' involvement in the 20th century civil rights movement for her lifetime commitment to social and economic justice. Dr. Brown got her BA in history from the College of Charleston, her master's from the Citadel, her PhD from Florida State University, and she also did studies on race, gender, and class at Howard University. She held staff and faculty positions at the College of Charleston, Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture. I officially met her in an official capacity at Claflin University, where she taught. She also taught at North Carolina A&T State, Hofstra University, Guilford College, and Bennett College for Women. She works and serves as a board member for the ACLU, and she serves on numerous organizations supporting quality public education for all students. She consults with local, state, and national historic institutions on issues of interpretation and inclusion. Dr. Brown is a recipient of many awards and recognitions as a champion for social justice, human rights, and equality. Dr. Brown speaks softly, but she carries a very big stick, my friends. She is always the voice in the room, raising critical questions no one else is asking. You can find Dr. Brown on YouTube, on a PBS program, America After Charleston, as well as local newspaper and magazine articles. She is retired, but not retired from this significant work. Since meeting Dr. Brown, my life has been so richly blessed, and I know that you will be blessed by her tonight. I am just honored and so very proud to know her and to have a relationship with her. And I just give God thanks for her. I've learned from her to be fearless and to preach and speak and not worrying about offending folks. So I appreciate you, Dr. Brown. You don't know how much you mean to me. Thank you for being here with us this evening.
Thank you. That was a heck of a short introduction. Now I'm talking, are y'all seeing me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I'm still learning Zoom, so glad to be with you. I really rarely lecture anymore. And so I don't mean to disappoint any of you, but I didn't come tonight with the idea that I was going to simply give you a lecture. I'm going to try to open up a few thoughts, and I would hope that we could have some opportunity. Ask me any questions that you wish, and I can, address those. I do not talk about myself and my experiences that easily for a number of personal but also political reasons, which I'm going to share with you. I always credit whatever involvement, contributions that I may have given to the world to two circumstances that I maintain I had nothing to do with. And that's very important, and it's humbling. Number one, when I was born and to whom I was born. Because the point is, you don't choose your parents. And I was born into a household with a father and a mother that were committed, what we used to call race people, race men and race women. It was a phrase that was used for as long as I can remember, but I think prior to their time as well, because it just meant that with all the trials and tribulations of being Black in America, people had to make decisions as to whether they were going to be recognized as speaking up against injustice, speaking up for the race, or simply accepting and being quiet. And so over time, through centuries, there are people who will be identified as race men and women. And my father and mother were two of them, in that they chose to affiliate with organizations that spoke to the current issues of discrimination, segregation, and what have you. And so that's the household I came into. And I don't take specific credit for my early introduction to civil rights and human rights struggles, because it kind of came with the territory. And secondly, the other circumstance that I had nothing to do with is the fact of when I was born. I'm born right in the middle of the 20th century. Therefore, you know, how do you avoid this stuff? You know, if you wanted to, you couldn't. You know, I'm coming at a time when many of the same questions that we're talking about today, in the middle of the, well, not middle, but as we get to 2020 in the 21st century, I'm born when these same questions were being raised, and they had been raised for many, 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 many years before that. But the reckoning that we call the civil rights movement of the mid 20th century is simply the time in which I came into being. And so everything that we can talk about tonight, I always buttress against those two, you know, who your parents were, what they taught you or did not teach you, you know, and when it is you came into some level of consciousness and maturity. I must make sure that we stress, Reverend Dees knows me, and some of you who may know of the work that I've done with school desegregation had to do with being the chief plaintiff in the case in South Carolina that led to the desegregation of schools. There were 11 of us in 1963 who actually went into the Charleston schools, Black students who went into the all-white Charleston schools. The case was originally in my sister's name, my older sister's name, but because South Carolina refused to adhere to the 1954 Supreme Court ruling, here we were 9 years later, still trying to get South Carolina to obey the Supreme Court. The case started with my sister. Well, and this happened throughout the country. The powers that be simply would sit on school deseg and would then try to challenge and say, well, that person who was the chief plaintiff is no longer eligible. They've graduated. And that was the case with my sister. She became a senior in high school. And that meant that the challenger, those who were being challenged, then said, case is moot, you know, start over and start at the bottom with your challenge. And these are challenges led primarily with the NAACP at that time. My father took great pride and I think some humor, because he used to always tell people, I have an ace up my sleeve. And that is, he had another daughter. And so he managed to get somebody at the courthouse to switch my sister's name and put my name. That meant that the case with me as the chief plaintiff, not Minerva Brown, but now Millicent Brown, is going to go forward for another 3 years. It had been in her name for about 5 or so years. And so by the time I get to 10th grade, we are finally 9 years after Brown versus Board of Ed, Topeka, Kansas. We are now, as a state, finally beginning to grapple with this court order. I never talk about those experiences without reminding everyone that while I was the chief plaintiff, there were these other children who were with me. And on that first day in September of 1963, we were all scattered. The case was ruled in our favor because it came out of Charleston, but people have to understand there were cases just like ours in Sumter. Don't know about Lugoff, but there was Sumter, there was Columbia, Greenville, Spartanburg, Rock Hill, Orangeburg, Beaufort. You know, they were all over the place. But the ruling said that with this being the lead case, this is what the decision was based upon. And very interesting, the judge decided that only the named plaintiffs in that one case would enter school that year. And so it is 1964 that if you look into the annals of the records around the state, you will find that that's when the rest of South Carolina schools actually began to desegregate, because the ruling said only the 11 of you in the one Charleston case can go into the schools in 63. That's just a little bit of clarifying the circumstance. Having said all that, and again, if you have specific questions, I don't mind addressing them, but as Reverend Dees knows, I don't take a lot of pleasure in replaying 1963. You know, I am not only someone who's spent her life teaching and advocating for human rights, but I'm still talking about the present and the future. Mm-hmm. And so while I am a historian by training and I love history, you're not going to find me wanting to go down memory lane a lot. Unless I feel there is some lesson that we as a group assembled here tonight, if there's some lesson from that past that we think we can carry forward, then fine. But I'm much more concerned with talking and listening and responding to any questions you may have or thoughts that I can share that talk about and how do we keep this thing moving forward. I care very deeply about the personal reflections that were shared. I think that's an important way to start your sessions. But it brought to mind the fact that, and there's nothing wrong with this, this is just a fact of life. We see the world through our personal experiences. And if it didn't cross our path, then we tend to think something did not exist. And so, brother man from New York, honey, this stuff was up in New York too, okay? Reverend Dees, okay? You know, but your circumstances were such that perhaps, you know, you were kept out of the fray in certain ways. I understand that. But for everybody, we have to just really be very, very careful when we don't confuse because it didn't happen to me, or I didn't treat somebody poorly, or my parents didn't use those words in my house. We just have to separate out, okay, those are my very private, close experiences. Now, let's take this conversation broader. Let's talk about the fact that racism and all of the other isms, but especially racism and hatred of those things African derived, that hatred has been here forever. It has always been here, showing itself in sometimes more subtle ways than others, but it's been here. Subtlety is what I talk to people about, because sometimes, because it was not overt, we minimize people's pain. We minimize how deeply ingrained all of this stuff is. And so I caution people with our language and with our understanding that minimizing anything, people's pain, people's experiences, is something we have to be very, very careful about. Minimizing as if it somehow couldn't have been that bad. Well, I have learned that it may not have been that bad for me, but it was that bad for somebody. And it means there's something I have to learn to address. Forgive me for not remembering everybody's name. I'm sorry. I took the gallery view off, so I can't refer to you each individually by name. But the idea that there are differences in class, and there are differences among Black folks with color, and there are degrees by which any of us has met with these challenges of racism. And all I can say is, let's humble ourselves always, just to remember that, and to be careful with our language and our interpretations, because we can't keep seeing things just through our own lens, I guess is my point with that. Y'all were talking earlier about your backdrops. Oh, I'm sorry. Was somebody trying to? Oh, okay. I was going to just share that while I can't show it to you, but speaking to my last point, I have a banner that says, "How come my pain becomes profit for others?" And it was made by a young person in an arts program here in Charleston, and a young person. And I cherish it because I am always careful to say to people, as we talk about racism, we have to tie in the harm, the disadvantage, the subjugation that goes with economic exploitation. It is tied to everything. I thought about the person talking about the birthday party, and when the owner didn't want the Black child to come to her birthday party. Just a point to remember. He backed down, to the credit of your parents for pushing the issue, but he suffered no economic consequences. Okay, so we have to always think about, okay, we can talk about other people's pain, but I think we have to always remember that there are usually consequences for putting pain and suffering on people. And so let's not always put the spotlight on the suffering and the people who suffered as important as that story is, let's also remember and consequences. Who did not suffer any consequences for putting that suffering? And I guess I'm trying to, my wording is in context with the topic that of the book and the chapter that you're reading, because I think this notion of suffering and shared suffering kind of draws us into what it is I've been saying and prattling on for the last 15 minutes or so. But the idea that let's broaden our view and remember, we don't just need to hear stories from people about how bad it was and how terrible it was, or thank goodness it wasn't worse. I think we have to broaden it and say, now what are we doing to make sure we recognize the suffering, the sufferees, and those imposing the suffering? And let me hold it right there and see if that conjures up anything you'd like me to respond to.
Talk about Charleston in that regard.
Charleston in that regard is being challenged, as is the state and certainly the nation, with, okay, we're supposedly recognizing the value of African descended people who built this city, this state, this nation. And folks are talking about, well, what do you do with that? And how do you repay them? And it is very frustrating because the simplistic ways that people think they are coming to atonement. One case in point is there is going to be an African-American museum that people are very excited about, Black and white, you know, and Charleston is saying, you know, this is our way of showing that we've come to grips with the past. I'm a part of the citizens advocacy group, literally, that has been working with that museum for 20 years, saying, in what ways is the Black community being advantaged by having an African-American museum? We tried to build in some economic revenue builders that would in some way benefit Black entrepreneurs or Black young people who want to get training. We said, let's put a hotel in that museum that can bring money in and can train and hire, you know, is there going to be a restaurant that can be Black owned and then used again as an economic driver? The answer, of course, is none of that, because basically the museum is to draw tourists. And then the city can talk about, oh, look at all these Black people that came from Charleston. And then if you're not being very, very critical, you will on the surface say, oh, that's great. Oh, the Black folks should be glad with this. We can't continue to accept that kind of superficiality. First of all, we're not at the table making any of these decisions. Secondly, we're not being recognized and respected enough to talk about how we think this institution should run, you know, and what its purpose should be. So with Charleston, and we could continue this in any community, but even well-meaning people who say, oh, wow, this is how we're going to show that we really honor and respect Black folks. Well, if you're doing it in the same old ways of top down, and you're going to tell us, now, this is how we're going to respect you. And we're saying, no, that's not good enough. Then obviously there is some conflict there. And so I use that example of, we honor Black folks, you know, we have a Gullah Geechee commission, or we recognize the existence of a Gullah Geechee commission. That's good. That's certainly a good step. But we've got to immediately then say, how are we addressing these issues of race in a way that is more respectful, more inclusive, and more understanding of what the real problems are? And that takes some heavy lifting, folks, because it's very easy to go with the simplistic.
Questions?
Sorry.
Hey,
Dr.
Brown. I have-
Brown.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. You go ahead. No, go ahead, please.
Thank you. What would you say to the white community in the 21st century who seems to have a difficult time recognizing some of the effects of entrenched racist policies on a national scale, and have a hard time recognizing sort of the subtle, nuanced forms of racism that have become that sort of fly under the radar since the end of the civil rights era? And then question number two: what are your views on reparations?
My answer to the first question is, let's first admit that while, do you remember my opening statements about just acknowledging that the way we see things is not necessarily the full reality? People have been talking about the reality of race and racism and suffering and pain based on color forever. So for those who are truly trying to learn, you got to study. You've got to go back, and you got to stop thinking that it's an argument that is somewhat new. You know, accept first the fact that people from the 15 and 1600s were already talking about this stuff, and that Black as well as white now, but especially Black scholars have been writing about this forever. And so the first step is educate yourself. And do not fall into the trap of thinking that these are new questions coming up. I love Ta-Nehisi Coates, went to school with his father. I'm very interested in the young man who has just gotten a lot of attention for writing How to Be an Anti-Racist, you know. But I'm worried because, as so often happens, we jump on the newest thing. I say to people, would you go back and read Martin Luther King's Where Do We Go From Here? Community or Chaos. That was written in the 50s, okay? And then, of course, we can go back even further than that, much, much further. But my point to your first question is simply, recognize that the problems aren't new, and our coming to the problems with all good intentions means that there's some work that must be done to fully understand and to recognize that answers have been there for a long time. They really have. And let's not jump on new bandwagons all the time. Okay, I think that's a starting point. I have for many, many, many years been in favor of reparations. I am old enough that I can share with you, when I was in college in the 60s, reparations was a joke. I am now 72 years old, And we are somewhere closer to getting HR 40 passed at the national level. And all HR 40 does is call for the creation of a study commission to have a serious conversation about how do you make amends and quote unquote pay for the suffering that has gone on for over 400 years. People are outraged sometimes, they dismiss it, they don't understand it. I understand all of those reactions, but we have a history that we can turn to. And we have world and global examples we can turn to. When people have been oppressed, there have always been some form of restoration. Mm-hmm. And that is a part of reckoning with the fact that people have been mistreated. And there are multiple examples we can learn from, but we've got to, and I think we are, move beyond dismissal because we don't understand it and it doesn't sound right, and so we just dismiss. Well, to me, that's the biggest sign of racism, is to say, because I don't understand it, it doesn't make sense to me, therefore, you know. What did I talk about earlier? The minimizing of suffering. We have got to do some heavy digging and say, maybe it will come about in this form, it might be that form. I'm not about to argue with people at this point. I want to be taken seriously. I'm wearing a shirt that, I don't know that you can see. Let me see if I can adjust it. But can y'all read that?
It looks like, and they sold like beasts.
Yeah.
Oh.
See, that's our beginning, you know. And when we talk about slavery and we throw the word out, oh, and somebody was a slave, but those were doing the slave day, you know, and I'm always very careful. Wait a minute, folks, do you hear? You have normalized the most atrocious, and I add to that what happened to Native Americans for sure, but you have normalized it with your language. You've minimized the suffering, and you didn't mean to. I mean, you know, you were taught it and you heard it, but the point is, that is the thing I'm calling our attention to, minimizing people's suffering. And if the suffering had stopped in 1865, for example, that might be a different discussion. But we know the suffering is today. Now, I started to say yesterday. The suffering is today. You know, it's today. And we have to grapple with that. A little bit longer answer than I guess you wanted, I'm sorry, but I just needed to tie those points together.
And I think that's what's so helpful. I mean, just hearing people sharing personal experiences. I mean, I think for me, probably one of the biggest ways to describe where I am is embarrassed that I didn't notice and see more of the reality of our world my whole life. And I think you've hit on it exactly. I mean, my world, my reality, my immediate environment seemed quite comfortable. And I don't know, I'm heartbroken that I wasn't able to see more.
Well, you are not alone, first of all, okay? And we're all heartbroken. I'm heartbroken. Every year of my life, I have learned something else that I had ignored before. You know, So that is a shared kind of humility that we can work on, but we got to be honest about it. Yeah.
I
We
think
can't be
do it.
dismissive.
And then figure out ways to be brave enough to speak up. One of the quotes from last week that stuck out to me, and I think Angela, you even mentioned it in the session. It's like the greatest injustice, the greatest problem in all of this is silence. Is the fact that it's not even, once you see it, you can't turn a blind eye to it anymore because you realize that it's there.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
which is why we must understand, forgive me for talking over you, but that is why we must understand the importance of recognizing it's not that this information doesn't exist. It's not that people weren't writing and proposing. At the end of the Civil War, we had plans for how we were going to, in some way, balance this atrocity called slavery. And so the whole 40 acres and a mule thing, had it been done back then, we wouldn't be sitting here now talking about this stuff. But now, we're trying to grapple with it intellectually, emotionally, in times when we can't even personally all relate to those events. But that is why it calls on us becoming political scientists, all of us. We better follow what happened with people in power. Why did Reconstruction fail? What was there about not wanting to share resources and political power that kept us going and going, and then marginalizing people more and more till we get to 2020 and we're being, wait, big whoopee-doo. We got a Black woman that's on the what do you call it? The platform for being possibly the first, Black vice president or whatever. Not that I'm not in support of it, but it's 2020, folks.
Yeah.
You see, and we just better harness our enthusiasm just a little bit, because I think we do ourselves a disservice when we get so happy and call it progress, you see. That's where my 72 years come in. I'm very skeptical about progress. I need to see something really happening. I need to see people really talking, not to make themselves feel good, but I need to see them actually doing something differently than what they did yesterday. That's progress for me. Yeah.
Thank you.
Dr. Brown, what you're talking about kind of sounds like what I heard Cornel West say one time. He said that, we think that if we put Black faces in high places, that's going to solve everything. And I think I wanted to bounce this off of you, because what feels different to me about the current, what I'll call this new civil rights movement we're seeing now, especially since the George Floyd murder, is that it is not focused on the acts of individuals. It's not focused on the acts of a George Wallace or a Bull Connor or whoever. It's trying to put the focus where it probably needs to be, which is on systems. In other words, it's not about individual racists, it's about the systems that create them. And that seems to be more of an emphasis of this movement. So for instance, when the police officers in the George Floyd matter were all charged and jailed, the protest didn't stop, because the idea was that really doesn't fix anything going forward unless we fix the system that produced Derek Van or whoever it was. Am I completely off base on that, or is that?
No, you're certainly not off base. And I do appreciate that there is a broader articulation about systemic racism. It's a very popular phrase now. I only say, Mortimer, please remember that Frederick Douglass was talking about systemic racism, Sojourner Truth was talking about systemic racism. So I agree with you wholeheartedly, and we have to raise that up because that's important. But this analysis isn't a new analysis.
Dr. Brown, Dr. Brown, Charlie Chalmers, on page 7, thank you so much. I've enjoyed you thoroughly. On page 73, Combs quoted that Martin King lived the meaning of the cross and thereby gave an even more profound interpretation of it with his life. And my question is, what are your thoughts on where the church universal, has been on racism?
You know the answer to that. Going to answer it in a little bit of a twisted way.
Yes, ma'am.
One of the things, and I hope you can appreciate this.
Sure.
One of the things over the years, I taught history at the college level for many years. And in teaching about civil rights, I often have had to correct people, even if they were just talking about Charleston or South Carolina. Usually they were talking about lots of places though, because they would talk about the Black church and the church did this and the church did that. And I've often had to say, oh, no. Not all AME churches, not all Baptist churches, Methodist, Certain individual ministers often led the charge. And so please stop giving credit, first of all, to the Black church, because as King, when he wrote his letter from a Birmingham jail, he had to criticize all the other Black churches that weren't standing with him. So whether that we're talking about Black congregations or white congregations, very, very often people want to take a collective credit. And so I say, always remember to look out for the individuals who led the charge, and don't assume that because they came out of Emmanuel AME Church, I don't mean to be ugly, y'all, but when Clemente Pinckney is killed in Emmanuel, members of Emmanuel were working to get rid of him as the pastor. But now Emmanuel is seen as, Mother Emmanuel, the home of this tragedy, See, we just got to be careful that we make these assumptions about who's in it and who's not. I then can answer you by saying, no, I don't know any denomination that has wholeheartedly stood up to any of the challenges of racism, classism, and all the other ills of our society. I know certain people, I know certain congregations. I don't know any whole denomination, We got to beg people to define what they mean by their faith. And if your faith doesn't put you out there in some way, shape, or form to resist and eliminate and dismantle all of these unequal circumstances, you ain't doing the work of the faith. You're just not. Mm-hmm. And I just won't make excuses for people. I love crediting people who try. But I'm very careful not to throw blankets over whole denominations, whole congregations, whole churches, because I think we start then basking in the sunshine of other people's efforts. And I think there's danger in that. I hope that makes some sense to you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Dr. Brown, I was curious if you would describe the difference between racism and prejudice. I know that these two words are very similar, but I would love for your interpretation of each and why they're different and why that difference matters.
I'm going to give you a quickie on that. Not that I don't like your question, but I don't know. I'm not sure it matters. Okay, my difference is we are, as human beings, we're wired to have prejudices. Prejudice means you like something more than you like something else. A prejudice for a food, a prejudice for a type of music. We are allowed our prejudices. There are people I don't like. Okay, I'm prejudiced on behaviors, you know, and that's something we have to live with. Racism is a whole different ball of wax. It is clearly meaning that we are identifying somebody by color, by this so-called thing, which is a made-up concept anyway, called race, but by color, and we are using it as a way to vilify anybody that looks like that, okay? And I don't use the words interchangeably because racism is something really, to me, very, very precise. It's very precise. Mm-hmm. And I'm gonna keep my prejudices, you know. I don't like hip hop music, probably never will, you know. You know, I got my prejudices, so be it. That's not where the problem is. It is the power to use color and race in ways that harm people who are innocent, who never did anything to you. You don't know, but you have categorized them, put them in a box, and decided you know them as a group, and you can deal with them as a group, and do so without afterthought.
Dr. Brown, I'd like to ask you a question, and I'll make it short. I can go through a real long thing. We did 2 civil rights legislations. I've been away from South Carolina for 40-something years. I always knew there'd be a certain amount of racism, but I figured it'd be 5%, 3%. In 2008, Barack Obama got reelected.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for the past 3.5 years, it's an alternate reality. It's more than 3 to 5. What is America really the way I've seen it now? We've made almost no progress. It's ugly out there.
It's ugly. And my answer to you is, I don't think we've made the kind of progress that sustains itself. And for me, and probably for you too, we want some sustainability. I am not going to say that my life as a Black woman in America in 2020 offers all the same challenges as 1963. You know, there has been change, but we sat on change, made assumptions about it, kind of decided that it meant more than it really did. And so the forces were able to galvanize and just offload, and, you know, depending on who's in charge, who's in the White House, who's in the State House, you know, it's just this back and forth thing. And it all gets very individualized. And so we may have to define what we mean by progress. And I don't want to get into an argument about, well, if my father was alive, he could go to the golf course around the corner because he couldn't do it when he was a young man. You know, okay, that's change. But now we are having to confront, what's the big lie that we have not really confronted? The big lie from the very beginning is we've taught and been taught lies. We have not ever been really taught, first of all, that all the grandiose things about this nation, American exceptionalism, we did this, we did that. Our history books are just filled with all of our good stuff. And then you didn't talk about the bad. So how can we talk about progress when we got half a story? Got half a story. I'm very glad that we are paying attention to women's suffrage. But if y'all are listening to any of those documentaries, and I hope you will, they're beginning to expose white women who got the right to vote, fought long and hard for it, but they made sure that Black folks got pushed out of that, so Black women aren't included. So we tell the story of the heroism of the suffrage movement. But we don't say that, but those white women said, okay, we can't fight both battles, so we're going to fight for women, but Black folks, no, y'all going to have to fight for yourselves. That is, see, I don't back away from truth. I just think when we get to the point of we tell the good and the bad, then the forces will come together to decide which we're going to pursue, the good or the bad. And we call that progress. But we don't call half-truths progress.
One of the things that I think about as I'm hearing and I'm listening and I'm just gleaning as much as I can, in reading this chapter, there were names that came out, or there were instances that came out that I thought, I know that I struggled with names and dates in history and school, but I don't struggle with remembering people's stories, especially when they're so emotionally charged. Mm-hmm. And there were names and experiences and instances that were mentioned in this chapter that I had not heard about till the first time I read this book. And thinking about that, I then kind of did some introspection of, okay, we had, African American History Month, but African American History Month was always to celebrate the current successful Black people in the world. We weren't talking about true African American history, because it's like you said, it would bring up embarrassment because it is the time of struggling, and it was struggle that was caused by privilege or by specifically causing struggle and ill treatment of people. And so there's that overwhelming feeling for me as the way that I put it is there was a switch that was flipped for me in recognizing I need to know more. I need to learn more. I need to educate myself. I was so glad to hear you say that, because I wasn't educated as fully as I always imagined I was. But as I do that, I find that there is an element of being overwhelmed, because I vacillate between being frustrated that I wasn't taught, or frustrated that it's not included in books, or frustrated that there are things that my friends of color, they know very well what happened in different times, and I have no clue. But also eating the elephant one piece at a time, but how slow am I eating that elephant? Is it fast enough? I mean, sorry, I'm all over the place, but it's this feeling of I want to be, I want to bear the cross. I don't want to wear the cross. And it's, when we wear things, it's so other people can see what we've got on. When we bear the cross, it is something that we silently hold on to, and it's between us and God. And I want to bear that cross. I don't want to wear it. Because I believe that in bearing it, God will make it apparent for others who need to be able to see it. Sorry, I'm all over the place.
No, and let me very quickly, because I want to hear from the others of you, but that recognition is important. First of all, it's a personal response to how heavy this stuff is. This stuff is heavy, okay? It's heavy for you, you know, try being Black in America, you know, it's heavy. Try being a Black parent who literally fears for their child every single day. And I am the mother of a Black man. And, you know, it's important that we recognize the weight, okay? Each of you, and I think everybody, decides what it is they will use to get through life, aware of these injustices. It seems to me that our commitment to complete honesty is the one thing that we can share, you know, and not honest by the way I perceive something, but honesty where I'm quick to ask, you know, am I seeing this right? I love Rachel Maddow, right? On MSNBC. She has a way of, when she does her newscast and she's interviewing somebody and she's done a recap and she says, before you respond, did I do a good job of summarizing how you felt about this issue, you know? And I really enjoy that idea, and I've been trying to do it myself. Don't assume you get it, you know? Ask people so that they have a chance to say, now, is that how you perceive it as well? You know, that kind of just individual honesty is really important. It's going to take you places that you may or may not want to go, because we're mad about how bad the history was taught. Well, that's going to take us to, now, who's making money? Why is it that it's out of Texas that all these textbook companies come and they decide what goes into 90% of the textbooks in this nation? Because somebody got a contract somewhere to say what we want said, okay? So now, whether you wanted to or not, you're now confronted with that economic reality that goes along with all this other ugliness, you know? And so I just say, these are heavy burdens. Probably being a human being has weight to it. Each of us will decide how much of that weight we can carry, but I think everybody can start from a foundation that says, I will not believe the good stuff because it makes me feel better. I will accept that there is much dishonesty out there and hidden agendas, and I'm going to keep my eyes open and query, you know, why are they saying that? What are they getting out of it? Are they saying this, you know, because they really mean it? Or is there something behind the scene? You know, it's called being skeptical. And I don't think skepticism is the same as cynicism. I try not to be cynical. I try to still think in an optimistic way, but I got a brain, and some would say that God gave me, then I'm going to use it to the fullest capacity. And that's what each of us can do.
Dr. Brown, you kind of answered some of what I had. My question was, is you're involved in education and everything. So are our schools getting any better at teaching correct history. I know when you and I grew up, the history we were taught was just way off the bat, you know. I mean, we were completely taught it wrong. But is the the younger generations, those that are in school now, is any of that changing? Are they beginning to learn the true history, or is it still being covered up?
It is certainly being covered up. I mean, I don't see, but again, going back to who it is that determines what's in those books, I don't see anything happening in the education industry and education literature that suggests that we're anywhere near where we should be. The improvement that I see is you have more brown faces, black faces. I mean, you know, there is some attempt at more inclusion, and that's not to be played down. I mean, I think that some efforts are being made, but one of the problems with whether it's African American History Month or African American history books or chapters, we have to just become so critical that are you only putting the stories out there? And this goes back to my criticism about the forthcoming museum. Are we putting stories out there, names, faces, that reflect what Black people did for America? See, that's a subtlety, but it's like, fine if I know that George Washington Carver did this and that somebody else did that, or this person was the first, right out of Columbia, Charles Bolden, you know, the first Black head of NASA, you know, an astronaut, you know, that's wonderful, good stuff. But the context is, we're going to give you some credit now for how you helped America get better. And that misses some of the point, because I'm tired of always hearing about what Black folks did to make America better. I'm ready for some conversations about how we got left out of the benefits and how we're going to work towards balancing that in some way, you know? So tell me about all these people who were the first to do this and the first to do that. I feel that that's a part, that's a step. But to answer whether we're getting better, it's troubling, because I think too much of it is, okay, throw out your good Black folks now, and you can tell your Black kids, be proud because this person became a congressman. You know, that misses the point. That misses the point. And so we have to be the ones that, while we may not be book publishers, but as we interact with our schools, our teachers, our PTAs, through our churches, whatever, we just say, okay, remember now, folks, there's another set of questions that need to go along with these textbooks. What are some things not being said? You know, I can't throw a blanket on answering your question, because there are some books that are getting it better, but because the book publishing industry is such a powerful, profitable industry, I can't look to them to get it right.
So the teachers can make a huge difference, because
Absolutely.
they can go off of the curriculum. And all of my grandchildren go to school in Baltimore. And I know some of the books that they have read are a lot different from what kids in South Carolina are reading.
Yeah.
Well, friends, we have gone long past our specified time because I was not willing to rein in the conversation. Sorry. But I do want to just ask if there are any final questions for Dr. Brown. Any final comments that you'd like to share?
I'm sorry, you were asking, do I have any final comments?
If they have any for you.
Oh, okay, the group.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Brown.
Thanks for
Yeah.
taking the time to share with us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you, Doc.
Well, you're more than welcome. I appreciate the opportunity. We need to continue to have these kinds of groups get together, but I'm going to leave you with a challenge, y'all, and I mean no offense.
Mhm.
But I heard this the other day and it struck me. Someone shared with me, when Black folks get traumatized, white folks form book clubs.
Mm.
Wow.
Mm.
I believe
Hold on.
in getting together to get educated and to discuss, believe me, but we have to figure out in our own respective communities and churches and spheres. Now, what am I going to do with all this insight? Where do I go from here? How do we make this have meaning outside just, I had a good discussion tonight? And there are many answers to that, but I'm going to leave that with you, that be thinking, what is it you can do in some small way? Doesn't have to be huge, but what can we do to move this thing forward? You know?
Amen.
And I celebrate that you have brought attention to that, because in one of our I think it was our very first gathering, it was brought up that a goal for us as a group is to have an action plan, a call to action, as we make our way through this on this journey together. It is wonderful to be further educated, and it's absolutely essential. Don't just sit on that education and sit on that information, but to apply it. So I'm.
You know what I have shared with several groups, especially when they are from houses of worship? We don't all have to do the big stuff. We look around. I said to, actually it was really my sister's church, and I said, there are flowers put on altars all over this state every Sunday. Has anybody ever decided whether they were going to contract with a Black florist so that we shared some of our revenue? Now, I didn't say you don't buy flowers from a white florist ever, but do you know what something simply as direct as extending economic benefit to a Black florist could mean to that business? And it wasn't either or, but one Sunday out of the month, you could commit that when we buy food for the food pantry, or when we purchase something, are we cognizant of the fact that we didn't include any Black businesses? That's something right in your direct community, your church, your altar, your cafeteria, whatever. That didn't mean you had to go out there and lead a rally and have a demonstration, but you recognize that without meaning to, you've been blind. And so now that you can see, let's go looking. Let's go finding the ways we can share benefit. We can share benefit. Thank you so much for having me, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Brown. Appreciate you.
Yes.
I'm going to leave you now.
Have a wonderful evening. God bless
Thank you,
you.
Doc.
Thank you. Thank you.
Very good.
Friends, it is, again, well past our normal time of saying goodnight and shalom. And so what I wanted to share with you is that while we have had an excellent chapter this week, there is much that can be discussed in this, but I believe that a lot of its concepts have been brought up and we have been able to talk and converse about them in today's events and things that are going on with great respect to that which Dr. Brown has brought. I want to thank Robin for her connection with Dr. Brown and for being willing to bring her here, trusting us enough with your friend to be here with us. So thank you, Robin. That is a great gift. There is going to be a time at the very end of our book study when we will have some time to go back and look at different aspects of the chapters, as well as different points that each chapter brings out. And so what I would encourage you to do is, if there are things that are specific in this chapter that you would like for us to have conversation about, if there's something specific that spoke to you or was provided you with an epiphany or a revelation, if you would make note of that in your book so that when we are at a place where we can have conversation, and to do that with any of the chapters that we have, if you had not felt like it was a time when you could talk about it or it didn't quite fit into that particular conversation we were having that night. Hilly, is there anything else you would like to add to that?
You've covered it sufficiently. Thank you for that.
Well, I want you to know that we are thrilled that you are here. We are so grateful for the opportunity to journey with you in this, and God's peace to each one of you. Would someone like to close us in prayer this evening?
How about one of our lay people?
I'd love that.
And
Go for
I
it,
would
Dr.
ask that we pray for Angela, for her husband Lee, who has been ill. So if we would just remember him in prayer, and her, because she's got to take care of him.
You know me so well. Thank you.
Let us pray. Lord, first we pause in the silence to acknowledge your presence with us here this evening, and we thank you. We thank you for yet another opportunity to come together as your children, to learn more about how to be in peace and harmony with one another. Lord, we ask that you cover everyone a part of this study, that you cover our study leaders, that you cover Angela and Lee. And we are thankful that they are feeling much better in body and in spirit. Lord, we ask that you continue to bless us and keep us. Keep us out of danger, seen and unseen. Lord, and we also ask that you continue to keep all your children in the hollow of your hand. It is in your matchless name that we pray and believe. Amen.
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 Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you all next Thursday. God's peace to you.
All right.
You too.
Have a good
Bye.
week.
You too.